world is divided into 4 spheres, each sphere divided among continents and nations. Nations are divided by borders and interests. These interests divide the news. We examine the impact of these divisions on people in power. This is Imaginary Lines. Welcome to the program. I'm your host, Michael Fox. The world of international soccer has been shaken by the largest corruption scandal in the history of FIFA, the international governing body. The scandal led to the resignation of long-standing FIFA president Sepp Blatter on June 2nd, less than a week after the U.S. Department of Justice launched historic indictment charges against 14 top soccer officials and sports marketing executives. Nearly all of them were from Latin America and the Caribbean, and the charges came just 2 weeks before this year's Copa America in Chile, which begins on June 11th. I speak with Andreas Campomar, author of the book Golazo, A History of Latin American Football, about the corruption scandal and what it means for Latin American soccer. But first, a look at media and Latin America. Honduras, the most violent country in the hemisphere, is in the midst of political turmoil once again. Thousands of Hondurans are demanding the resignation of President Juan Orlando Hernandez after it emerged that more than $200 million were allegedly siphoned out of the Honduran Social Security Institute to the ruling right-wing National Party for use in Hernandez's 2013 presidential campaign. The scandal follows a highly controversial Honduran Supreme Court decision in April to change the constitution to eliminate the presidential term limits and allow for re-election. The democratically elected government of former President Manuel Zelaya was ousted from power in a military coup in 2009 for simply asking if Hondurans would consider, through a vote, removing term limits. Since the 2009 coup, Honduras has become a neoliberal playground. The post-coup governments have pursued favorable concessions to extractive industries and have struck deals with the International Monetary Fund. Institutions such as Social Security have been effectively privatized. Before the 2009 coup, both foreign and domestic media were up in arms over Zelaya's alleged power grab. Yet today, in the face of a massive corruption scandal, a move to remain in power, and policies that have increased poverty and militarized Honduran society, the major international media is all but silent. On May 27th, the U.S. Department of Justice launched indictment charges against 14 sport marketing executives and top soccer officials at FIFA, the international governing body for soccer. The individuals were charged with racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering, as well as bribery valuing over $150 million for sponsorships, broadcasting rights, tournament location selection, and vote buying during FIFA elections. It's the largest scandal in the history of this century-old organization, and it came just 2 days before the re-election of longtime FIFA president Sepp Blatter, and 2 weeks before the start of the Women's World Cup in Canada and the Copa America in Chile. Andreas Campomar is the London-based Uruguayan author of the 2014 book Golazo, A History of Latin American Football. Andreas, thank you so much for joining me on Imaginary Lines.
Thank you for having me.
Andreas, 12 of the 14 officials indicted on charges were from Latin America and the Caribbean. What's your analysis of the FIFA scandal, and what does this mean for Latin American soccer?
Well, it really doesn't surprise me. I mean, corruption has been part of the Latin American game for decades now, and even some would say the kind of very start of the game on the continent. So in a sense, it is really the end of the road for kind of Latin American corruption in the game. And I think, given what's happened, I think that will change now, in a sense that Latin Americans have woken up, and especially given that it's come from the US, that it's been taken out of our hands as Latin Americans, that is kind of fundamental. The idea that on the continent we cannot do it for ourselves, but maybe the Americans can do it for us. Maradona, who's been a critic of the US for decades now, he's even come out in their favor. So I think that's a very important thing.
Will these indictments actually address corruption in the sport, or will it just shuffle the chairs? Is this the beginning of the end of FIFA as we know it?
Well, I think it might be the beginning of the end, in terms of the fact that I think a lot of people in Latin America, both fans and both people at an institutional level, have finally thought, well, maybe this is it. Maybe we can change, soccer and the way it's handled rather than the way it's played. So I do see an end to that. But the problem is there is so much money in the game these days. And, if you read The Open Veins of Latin America, Eduardo Galeano, the Uruguayan polemicist, talks about the commoditization of Latin America. And we have this today with its players. So as long as the players flow out of Latin America and where there's money, there might still be corruption. But I think it may be a wake-up call for the average fan who says, enough is enough.
Nearly this entire investigation was specifically focused on individuals from Latin America and the Caribbean. Yet we know that corruption exists in European soccer and elsewhere. Why were no European soccer leaders included in this corruption investigation?
Well, I think, for a long time, the monies have flowed back into Latin America and the players have come from Latin America. And I think that's a very important point. And I think when the best players do come from the region, what you're going to find is very sophisticated financial transactions and also quite a lot of money in the way that it wouldn't come from other regions. So it doesn't surprise me that most of those accused come from the region, not just South America itself, but Central America and the Caribbean, because that's home to, as I've said before, the kind of better players in the world, especially those players that are going to fuel the kind of leagues of Europe and also the Champions League.
Andreas, is FIFA really cleaning house?
Well, I think it needs to, and it's under pressure in a way that I don't think it has been before. We have to remember that FIFA, I think it was in the early noughties, nearly went bankrupt and now is a kind of billion-dollar industry, as it were. I think they have to be seen to be doing so, and I don't think they can get away with it again. I mean, here in Europe, it's garnered so many headlines that people have asked, is there any story but this FIFA story in the last week? So I think they have to be seen to be doing it.
What effect will these corruption indictments have on the upcoming Copa America in Chile and on the Women's World Cup in Canada?
I think sitting here in Europe, and I watch the European leagues, and you see Latin Americans shine week in, week out. If it's not a Chilean who plays for Arsenal, it's a Uruguayan who plays for Barcelona. And I think we will see probably the kind of best that world football has to offer. I think it is one of the great competitions in the world. I think the qualifying rounds for the World Cup in Latin America are probably the hardest in the world, the most difficult of any qualification. And I personally think we don't get enough places, we don't get enough berths, and there are no easy matches. And I think that the Copa America is the best that football has to offer. And to see these guys who play for different teams, both within Latin America and without, I think to see them playing together and playing so well, and playing teams in a kind of football that they're allowed to play, a very Latin American football, I think is very important. This is a Latin American tournament for Latin Americans. It's a tournament that we can be very proud of, and we should be proud of. And I think it's some of the best football that one can see. So I hope for a good tournament, and I think we're going to see hopefully some upsets. We'll see teams not doing as well as they might, and I think that makes for a fantastic tournament this year.
Andreas, thank you so much for joining me on Imaginary Lines.
Thank you very much.
In May, Ireland became the first country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage through a referendum at the ballot box. Coverage of the referendum in the corporate press reflected, by and large, a wide support for marriage equality more generally. While the triumph of gay rights in Ireland should most certainly be celebrated, the fact that minority rights were delivered through a popular consultation has prompted an interesting question. Should minority rights be subject to the will of the majority? Many gay rights advocates say no. Among them are members of the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association. They cite the possible repercussions of such a referendum should it fail to pass, A loss at the ballot box would constitute a major setback for marriage equality and would provide opponents with easy arguments centered on the, quote, will of the people. This is exactly what occurred in many states in the United States from the late 1990s through roughly 2009. During this period, referenda were passed by the voters in dozens of U.S. states prohibiting gay marriage. But could it be that the tides are turning? Since 2012, in the lead-up to the Irish election, 4 U.S. states have approved gay marriage via referendum, including my home state of Maryland. Pro-life conservative media blame this shift on slick, new media-savvy campaigns in favor of gay marriage. This may be true, but at least in the case of Maryland and Ireland, simple, old-fashioned, on-the-ground organizing also played a key role in helping to move voters to support inclusive marriage. But the question is far from over. Gay marriage is ultimately a civil rights issue, and the strategy to secure these rights will most certainly vary from country to country. Individuals and media outlets should take pause before tacitly advocating for the Irish model to be applied elsewhere. That's it for the program. Thanks for watching the show. I'm your host, Michael Fox. Please join me next week.